coalition. Let's go to Jonathan Sachidadi in London, I24 News European correspondent. Jonathan, good morning to you. Looking at David Cameron's yesterday making headlines across the world, is there a acceptance? Is there are we looking at, you know, Britain joining that coalition, so to speak?
Morning, Yael. No, there isn't an acceptance, and that's a problem that Mr. Cameron is trying to face at the moment. And in a way, this has been overshadowed, this decision, by the domestic political soap opera that has been caused by Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, who is the leader of the opposition, well known for his opposition to many military interventions, and this one's no exception. Mr. Corbyn had a meeting of his shadow cabinet yesterday, shortly after, in the House of Commons, David Cameron brought up the case for Britain getting involved in those strikes on Syria. And rumour has it that those shadow cabinet members were two-thirds in favour of backing Mr. Cameron and the choice of intervention. However, Mr. Corbyn, a matter of hours later, wrote a letter to all Labour MPs telling them that he personally could not support the Prime Minister's position, which leaves the Labour Party in a very awkward position and then leaves the country in a very awkward position, because Mr. Cameron will not hold another vote on whether Britain will get involved in those strikes without the knowledge that, unlike 2013, he might actually win it. Of course, in 2013, he held a vote for intervention against Assad, and now it's against ISIS. So the case is building, but it's definitely not something on which there's certain agreement.
Certain agreement, but quickly on that one, is there public, or do we have any inclination of knowing, is there public support within the British society for an intervention?
Again, there is division among the public whether or not this will make Britain safer at home, whether or not Britain should be getting involved in another potentially costly and potentially lengthy war in the Middle East. After Afghanistan and Iraq, many Britons are very wary about such a thing, but others feel that this is what's necessary to show ISIS that similar attacks on the streets of London or another major UK city are not acceptable, and to strike them at their core. But again, there's no absolute agreement on these things, and it's very difficult for a Prime Minister in those circumstances to act knowing that he has the support of members of Parliament and of the population.
Now, thank you for that, Jonathan. Do stay with us if you can. Joining us from London also is former British ambassador to Syria, Emirates Ambassador Peter Ford. Mr. Ambassador Ford, I want to thank you for being with us this morning. Approximately a year ago, you wrote a very critical report, very critical op-ed about David Cameron, discussing his arrogant Syria policy when he was calling for intervention post the Assad, so to speak, post the Assad gassing of his people. Do you stand by that report? Do you stand by that op-ed this time around as well? Do you agree with David Cameron, with the Prime Minister, that Britain should join more forcefully that coalition against ISIS?
I stand by every word, and I'm totally opposed to Britain joining the bombing operations against IS. I listened with interest to your report earlier. What wasn't mentioned is that Mr. Cameron has his own rebels. He has not been able to convince an important minority of about 20 Conservative MPs to back him, and this is exactly why he's dependent on Labour votes. But strangely, no one speaks about Mr. Cameron's inability to rally all his troops. All the focus is on Jeremy Corbyn, who is standing to a principled position which has a lot of support at many levels of British society. In any case, if Mr. Cameron does win the vote, and at the moment it looks more likely than unlikely, if he wins, it's likely to be a Pyrrhic victory, because in a matter of weeks or possibly months, there will be an atrocity in London or Manchester or Birmingham, and who will then be blamed? Not Mr. Corbyn, who will have got it right.
No, sadly, I hope you're wrong in saying that, but I mean, it's safe to say that, the direction of IS, or some form of atrocity, is Europe. Quickly, though, Ambassador Ford, then what do you think should be done when it comes to Syria at this point in IS? If you heard also Emil Oren in studio, the notion that troops should go back there, or that the coalition understands that an international group of a force of troops has to be on the ground in order to combat this phenomena that is the Islamic State.
This will never happen. In fact, there is another perfectly good plan on the table in the form of the Vienna process being led by the Russians and with increasing American backing. This provides for a ceasefire among willing parties in Syria. Those willing parties would then turn their attention to dealing with IS and the Al-Qaeda-affiliated terror groups while moving forward on a political transition track. This is an excellent plan.
A political transition
some parties are trying to undermine it, notably Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states.
No. And if you also can do... thank you, by the way, Ambassador Ford. I'm turning to Amir Oren right now because this is fascinating. A plan that is on the table, but we know what happened to a plan as such or to those discussions in Vienna in the past. Can all of this happen without the removal of Bashar al-Assad?
Well, first, the Vienna plan is very sensible.
The players on the ground may not be.
The only omission is the IS. The IS, of course, is not a party to this plan. It has plans of its own. And what Ambassador Ford has just suggested is actually that the IS has the power of deterrence over Britain. If the ambassador is talking about an atrocity bound to take place in a major UK city once the British increase their involvement against the IS, this means that in order to forestall such an involvement, the IS can deter Britain by holding the threat of such an atrocity over the heads of the British. This is unacceptable. I think he's also
describing what many European leaders feel at this point.
But this atrocity will take place or will not independently of the British decision whether to go in or not. Now, regarding the removal of Bashar Assad, this is inevitable by now. And the Russians, of course, would have no qualms, just as one of Mr. Putin's predecessors, a gentleman by the name of Stalin, had no qualms in signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement a week before the Germans invaded Poland and started World War II. Putin will sacrifice Assad if he gains everything else. And he will gain some sort of a Russian puppet regime headed by someone else, not Bashar Assad. And Bashar will have to retire and go back to practicing his ophthalmology.
In Moscow, maybe.
Or in London.
Or in London. Hold on one second. Jonathan Sachedati, just to culminate this, because a little bird in my ear tells me that you're nodding. Yes.
Well, just to add as well that people in Britain, whether they're MPs or regular citizens, are also aware of why there is a case for going to war. Back in 2013, when Peter Ford, who you just spoke to, said that David Cameron was demonizing President Assad, people were aware that his weapons, his chemical weapons, killed 1,400 Syrians. People are aware now that ISIS are beheading journalists and other prisoners from around the world. These are images that people can't forget either. And so the case for doing something about this rising threat, which in itself is apparently opposing another tyrannical regime in the region, means that some people are in favor of there being some form of intervention, and Britain joining its allies in that, if only as a symbolic gesture to show that Britain stands on the right side of history in this example.
Jonathan Sachedati, I want to thank you for joining us this morning, as well as Ambassador Ford and Christiane Malard and Amir Oren. I'm locking you in studio as we move along.